The sound of a slap, sharp, unmistakable. It echoed through the luxury cabin like a gunshot in a cathedral. Nadia Ellison didn't flinch. She couldn't, because in seat 1A on a jet her own company built, every pair of eyes was locked on her. And then came the words that cut deeper than the sting on her cheek. You people need to learn your place. In that suspended moment, the aisle became a stage. 12 first-class passengers, phones raised, a senior flight attendant, hands trembling with rage, and a CEO who had spent a lifetime building power, now challenged in front of strangers at 38,000 feet. But who really had the power here? And what happens when the person you try to humiliate turns out to control the very skies you're flying in? This was not just about a slap. It was about pride, prejudice, and the quiet strength that can turn a single moment into a movement. Stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe to Real Life Stories New, and see how one woman's calm refusal to be moved changed everything. The sound was sharp. It cut through the quiet hum of the engines and froze every breath in the luxury cabin. Dr. Nadia Ellison's cheek stung with heat. The skin tingled where the hand had landed, but she didn't move, not even an inch. She simply blinked once, her gaze steady, her back straight in seat 1A. Across from her, Karen Whitfield stood in the aisle, chest heaving, her eyes narrowed with something darker than anger. Her voice trembled, but the words were cold and precise. You people need to learn your place. The sentence lingered in the air like smoke. Somewhere behind them, a spoon clinked against a porcelain cup. A passenger's hand hesitated halfway to their mouth. Another passenger slowly lowered a newspaper, eyes wide. No one spoke. No one moved. The private business-class cabin of Ellison Aerospace Flight 217 had been peaceful only moments ago. 10 rows, 12 passengers, crisp linen headrest covers, polished chrome accents catching the soft glow from the reading lights, and now a storm, condensed into one narrow aisle at 38,000 feet. Nadia kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. She would not give Karen the satisfaction of flinching. Her breathing was even, but inside, the air felt heavy. The slap had been sudden. No warning. Just a burst of motion and the sting that followed. Her mind tried to make sense of it, but the truth was too familiar. She had felt versions of this her whole life in the boardroom when she was the only black woman at the table. In negotiations where her voice was ignored until a man repeated her idea. In the look she received when boarding first class in a tailored suit. But this was different. This was public. Karen's shoulders rose and fell, the adrenaline still flooding her system. She glanced over her shoulder at the other passengers, seeking approval, an ally, someone who would nod and agree. No one did. From the corner of her eye, Nadia saw Mariah Cortez in seat 3C, frozen, her hand resting on the edge of her tray table. Mariah's lips were pressed together, as though holding back the urge to speak. The cabin door to the galley slid open. Robert Kane, the head flight attendant, stepped into the aisle. His face was pale, his eyes darting between Nadia and Karen as if walking into the middle of a fire. "What's going on here?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his hands tightened around the edge of the service cart. Karen turned toward him instantly, her tone rising with conviction. "This woman is not supposed to be in that seat. She doesn't belong here. I asked her to move and she refused." Nadia remained silent. Her silence was not weakness. It was choice. Robert's eyes flicked to Nadia, then down to the passenger manifest on his tablet. A pause, his brows knitted. "Her credentials are in order," he said quietly. "She's the registered passenger for 1A. Karen's jaw tightened. "I don't care what the manifest says. People like her find ways to cheat the system. It's not fair to the rest of us." The words sliced through the air like a blade. A low murmur rolled through the cabin. A man in seat 2B shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the back angled her phone slightly, the lens peeking over the top of the seat in front of her. Nadia could feel every eye on her. She could feel the pressure building, the weight of expectation to either break down or lash out. But she did neither. Instead, she thought of her mother, standing tall on a city bus decades ago when a driver told her to move for someone more important. She remembered the stillness in her mother's face, the way dignity could be louder than shouting. Karen stepped closer. The faint scent of her perfume drifted across the narrow space between them. "So, are you going to move? Or do I have to call security when we land?" Nadia finally turned her head, meeting Karen's eyes. Her voice, when it came, was calm. "You don't know who I am." Karen's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. Another one of them. Always demanding, always playing the victim, always taking something that doesn't belong to you." The heat behind those words was personal. It wasn't just policy or protocol. It was venom. Robert shifted uncomfortably. But Karen wasn't finished. She's a shadow fell over them. From the far end of the cabin, a tall man in a dark suit moved forward with deliberate steps. His ID badge caught the light as he approached. Air Marshal Derek Shaw. His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "Ma'am, please step away from the passenger." Karen's face lit up with relief. "Thank you. Finally, someone who understands. She's causing trouble, and I was talking to you." "Ma'am." Derek interrupted, his eyes locking onto hers. Not her. The change in the cabin was instant, a collective intake of breath, a shift in posture. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out for a moment. Then, flustered. "You're making a mistake. I'm just doing my job." "Your job isn't to assault passengers," Derek replied, his tone like steel. He turned to Nadia. "Are you hurt?" For the first time since the slap, Nadia allowed herself a small nod. "Yes." "Did she hit you?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "In front of everyone?" Nadia answered. Derek straightened, his decision final. "Ma'am, place your hands behind your back." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was followed by a wave of whispers, the rustle of clothing, the shifting of bodies as passengers leaned for a better view. Karen's eyes darted from face to face, searching for someone to defend her. None did, as Derek guided her down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. The only sound was the steady thump of his footsteps and the muted buzz of a phone camera capturing every moment. Nadia stayed still, her heart steady, her gaze fixed on the window. Outside. The sky stretched endlessly, hers to own, no matter who tried to take it from her. The air felt heavier now, as though the cabin itself understood what had just happened. Nadia sat motionless, her cheek still warm from the slap. She could feel the faint pulse beneath her skin, the sting a reminder of what she had endured only moments earlier. The hum of the engines had always been a comfort to her on flights, a steady backdrop to hours spent in the sky. But now it was distant, muffled, like hearing it from underwater. Karen was gone from her immediate view, escorted to the back by Derek Shaw, but her presence still lingered like the fading note of an unpleasant song. Nadia did not move her hands from her lap. Her posture remained perfect, a subtle defiance in itself. She was aware of every eye that glanced her way, every shift of a seat cushion as passengers turned to get a better look. The quiet had an edge to it now, sharp enough to cut. Robert Kane stood near the galley, scrolling through something on his tablet, avoiding direct eye contact. He looked like a man caught between two storms, unsure which would hit harder. In seat 3C, Mariah Cortez finally exhaled. She leaned slightly toward the aisle and spoke just loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear. That was wrong. All of it. Her words were simple, but they rippled through the air. A few passengers nodded faintly. Others stayed still, unsure whether to show agreement. Nadia caught Mariah's gaze briefly and offered a small, polite nod. It was enough to say thank you without breaking her composure. The man in 2B cleared his throat. I've flown with this airline for years. I've never seen anything like that. His voice carried both shock and discomfort, as if admitting the truth out loud made it more real. Nadia's thoughts drifted inward. She had always known the skies could be as divided as the ground below. She had built Ellison Aerospace with the belief that everyone deserved dignity in travel, no matter their background, their appearance, or their bank account. Yet here she was, in the cabin of one of her own planes, being told she did not belong. Her mind replayed the moment in slow motion, Karen's sharp inhale, the sudden swing of her arm, the sound that cut through the cabin, and then the eyes, all those eyes watching. What unsettled her most wasn't the slap itself. It was the way so many people had frozen, unsure, unwilling to intervene. She wondered if silence felt safer to them, if they had convinced themselves it was not their fight. She knew that silence well. It was the same kind she had faced in boardrooms when colleagues looked away from unfairness because speaking up was riskier than pretending not to notice. Robert finally approached her row. His voice was low, his words careful. Dr. Ellison, are you comfortable? Do you need medical attention? Nadia turned her head slightly toward him. I'm fine. He hesitated. I want you to know I'll file a report. This isn't how we conduct ourselves. Nadia studied him for a moment, reading the flicker of unease in his eyes. Then, make sure it's not just a report that disappears into a file cabinet. Her tone was even, but the message was unmistakable. Robert gave a small nod before retreating toward the galley again, as though proximity to her was both a duty and a weight. Mariah leaned out a bit more from her seat. I'm an attorney. If you need a witness statement, I'll give one. Nadia's lips curved just enough to show appreciation. Thank you. That means more than you know. The man in 2B shifted in his seat, as if struggling with something inside him. Finally, he said, I should have said something sooner. His admission hung in the air, and Nadia did not offer comfort or blame. She simply looked at him and said, It's never too late to choose the right side. That seemed to sit with him, heavier than the silence before. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Flight attendants whispered in the galley. The occasional clink of a coffee cup punctuated the quiet, but no drink service resumed. From the back of the cabin came faint sounds, Derek's measured voice, the muffled protest of Karen still insisting she had been right. The words were too distant to make out clearly, but the tone carried a stubborn refusal to accept reality. Nadia closed her eyes briefly, not to block out the world, but to center herself. She thought of the times in her career when people had underestimated her, the pitches where investors assumed she was the assistant, not the founder. The trade shows where they mistook her for someone lost, looking for the restroom. She had learned that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it was in the stillness, the refusal to let someone else decide your worth. The public humiliation could have been met with rage, and part of her wanted to unleash the years of patience she had held back, to let her voice fill the cabin and force everyone to choose a side. But another part of her, the part that had built an empire from nothing, knew better. Karen's slap might have been the spark, but it would not be the fire that consumed Nadia's composure. From somewhere near the rear, the cabin phone chimed. Robert answered quietly, nodded once, then replaced the handset. He walked briskly toward Nadia's row. "Dr. Ellison," he said, voice pitched low. "The captain wanted me to let you know we'll be landing in under an hour. The air marshal has the situation contained." Nadia inclined her head in acknowledgement. Her eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath them, silver blue under the midday sun. A view she had loved since her first flight as a little girl. A view no one could take from her. Mariah glanced at her watch, then at Nadia. "You know, this isn't going away quietly. There are at least 3 people in here filming." Nadia's gaze met hers again. "I'm counting on it." For the first time since the slap, a faint smile touched her lips. It wasn't joy, it was resolve. The tension in the cabin had shifted. The initial shock had settled into something else, a waiting. A collective breath held until the plane touched down and the consequences began. Even those who had stayed silent now seemed restless, as though they sensed history unfolding in their aisle. Nadia sat back against the seat, her posture still perfect. She adjusted the cuff of her blazer, smoothed the edge of her skirt. Small, precise movements that said she was still in control. Control mattered, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Everyone who might one day find themselves in this same narrow aisle, facing the same choice between silence and standing. And she knew. This was only the beginning. The cabin air was still heavy when Karen's voice cut back into it, sharp and unyielding. She had returned to the aisle, her wrists free for now. Her eyes locked on Nadia like she was determined to reclaim something she believed she had lost. "She's not supposed to be here," Karen announced, louder this time. Her gaze swept over the passengers as if inviting them to side with her. "She's sitting in a seat she didn't pay for. You all saw it. You know it's wrong." A few heads turned. Some passengers avoided her eyes. Others leaned subtly away, not wanting to be drawn into the confrontation. Nadia remained still in 1A, her back straight, her chin level. She could feel the tension crawling back into the cabin, could feel the way the silence after Karen's words seemed to demand a reaction, but she gave none. Karen took a step closer, her voice dropping but still carrying to the nearest rows. "This is the problem. People like her always find a way to take advantage, always playing the victim when they get called out." The phrase "people like her" was meant to cut, and Nadia felt it slice against the years she had spent proving her worth in rooms that questioned her before she even spoke. From 3C, Mariah Cortez finally spoke again. Her tone clipped. "What exactly do you mean by people like her?" Karen turned to her sharply. "You know exactly what I mean. Some of us work hard, follow the rules, and others just walk in and think they're entitled to whatever they want." Mariah's brows rose, and you decided the best way to enforce your rules was to hit her. In front of everyone, Karen's lips thinned. Sometimes people need to be shown boundaries. There was a ripple in the cabin then, a shift in the atmosphere as several passengers exchanged glances. The man in 2B shook his head slowly, muttering something under his breath. The woman in 4A began typing quickly on her phone, her thumbs moving with urgency. Robert Kane reappeared from the galley, stepping between Karen and Nadia. His voice was low, controlled. "Karen, you need to stop. The situation is being handled. Dr. Ellison is a verified passenger. You have no grounds to challenge her seat." Karen's eyes flashed. "Oh, you're taking her side now. You don't know how many times people like this have gotten away with Robert cut her off." His voice firm. "That's enough." But Karen was already leaning to the side, trying to catch Nadia's eyes again. "You think sitting there quietly makes you better than the rest of us? You think being dressed up in a nice suit means you deserve more?" Nadia turned her head just enough to meet Karen's stare. Her voice was calm, almost quiet. "I think I deserve the same respect as any passenger on this plane." Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "Respect is earned. Inside." Nadia felt the familiar push and pull. One part of her wanted to stand, to let her voice rise above the hum of the engines, to lay out in clear, unflinching words every injustice that had led to this moment. But the other part, the part that had kept her steady through years of scrutiny, held her in place. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozen eyes watching. It was about the phones quietly recording, the videos that would be played and replayed in rooms she might never enter. From the back of the cabin came Derek Shaw's voice, steady but moving closer. He was speaking into his radio, his presence like the slow roll of distant thunder. Passengers began to shift in their seats, sensing something was about to change. Karen kept talking, her tone more desperate now. "She doesn't even belong here. Look at her. You really think she's the type who buys a ticket for 1A, no? She probably sweet-talked someone, got a free upgrade, and now she's milking it for attention." The accusation hit the air with a sour weight. It was a direct attempt to strip away Nadia's legitimacy, to recast her as an imposter. Mariah sat forward. "Do you even hear yourself? You assaulted her, in public, in your uniform, and now you're doubling down on it." Karen turned on her. "You don't know what it's like to deal with people who think they're above the rules every single day." Mariah's voice didn't waver. "I do, and you're proving you're one of them." A murmur ran through the nearby seats. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered, "This is going to be all over the news." Robert stepped in again, his patience thinning. "Karen, return to the galley. Now." Karen's hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't move. Her jaw tightened as if the act of stepping back would mean she had lost something she refused to surrender. Nadia watched her, studying the way her anger seemed to feed on itself. There was something almost fragile in the way Karen stood there, as if the fury was holding her together, and without it, she might collapse. Derek Shaw's steps were audible now, measured and heavy on the carpeted aisle. Conversations died. Eyes shifted from Karen to him. His presence pulled the focus of the entire cabin. Karen glanced over her shoulder, and for a moment, relief crossed her face. She thought he was coming to back her up. Finally, he was there, tall and steady, looking between the two women. His voice was low, deliberate. "What's happening here?" Karen spoke quickly, gesturing toward Nadia. "She's causing trouble, refusing to move from a seat she didn't pay for." Derek's eyes didn't leave hers. "And you believe that justifies hitting her?" Karen blinked. I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," Mariah said quietly from her seat. Robert exhaled, the tension in his shoulders visible. "Marshall. Doctor, Ellison's boarding pass and credentials are in order. She's the rightful occupant of 1A. The shift in Derek's stance was subtle but final. His voice dropped half an octave. "Ma'am, please step away from the passenger." Karen let out a short, almost incredulous laugh. "Finally. Thank you. Now maybe we can—" "I was speaking to you," Derek said, his tone like steel. The words landed like another slap, but this time the entire cabin felt it. Karen's expression faltered. "You're making a mistake." Derek's gaze didn't waver. "The only mistake here is thinking you could put your hands on a passenger and walk away without consequences." From several rows back, a phone camera zoomed in. The moment had become something larger than the plane. Karen looked around again, but the support she sought wasn't there. The passengers who had avoided eye contact earlier now met her gaze only to make it clear they were not on her side. Nadia sat quietly through it all, her hands still folded, her breathing steady. She knew this was the pivot point. From here, the story would no longer be just between her and Karen. It would belong to everyone watching, and she intended to make sure they understood what they had seen. The aisle seemed narrower with Derek Shaw standing in it. He was tall, his shoulders squared beneath the dark suit, the glint of his air marshal badge catching the soft overhead light. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Karen's posture wavered the moment his presence filled the space between her and Nadia. For a split second, she looked almost relieved. Relief that someone in uniform, someone with authority, might take her side and end this uncomfortable standoff. But Derek's eyes were not searching for allies. They were assessing, measuring, weighing every detail. His gaze lingered on Nadia, then returned to Karen, steady and unblinking. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "step away from the passenger." Karen's relief bloomed into a short laugh, brittle but confident. "Thank you. Finally. I've been trying to get her to move for 20 minutes. She's in a seat she did not pay for." Derek did not look away. "I was speaking to you, ma'am, not her." The cabin shifted in an instant. A low hum of whispers moved through the rows. Heads turned. A few passengers leaned forward, their eyes sharpening with sudden interest. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Her voice, when it returned, was tight. "You must not have the full story." "I have enough." Derek cut in. "You put your hands on a passenger. That's not a misunderstanding. That's an assault." The words landed heavy. Mariah Cortez's gaze flicked between them, her expression unreadable but her eyes alert. The man in 2B leaned slightly into the aisle, as if afraid to miss a single detail. Karen took half a step back, her hands curling at her sides. "I was just doing my job." "Your job does not include physical contact with passengers unless it's to protect them from harm," Derek replied. His voice carried no anger, just a firmness that was harder to argue with than shouting could ever be. Robert Kane approached cautiously from the galley, his voice quieter. "Marshall, Dr. Ellison's boarding pass is valid. She's the registered occupant of 1A." Derek nodded once without breaking eye contact with Karen. Then we have no further discussion. Ma'am, you need to return to the rear of the aircraft until we land. Karen shook her head, disbelief spreading across her features. You're just going to take her word for it. You don't even know who she is. I do, Derek said, and for the first time, his tone softened slightly. And it wouldn't matter if I didn't. The rules are the same for every passenger. Nadia had not moved. Her gaze remained on the window, the clouds drifting like slow rivers below, but she was listening to every word, feeling the tension begin to tilt. Karen's voice sharpened again. This is ridiculous. She's probably recording this so she can sue. That's what people like her do. They create a scene. They play innocent. Then they cash in. Gasps broke the air from more than one row. Mariah let out a short, humorless laugh. You're digging your own grave. Derek's eyes narrowed. Enough. Ma'am, place your hands behind your back. The click of metal was louder than it should have been. Karen stiffened as the cold bite of the handcuffs wrapped around her wrists. She glanced over her shoulder at the passengers, searching desperately for a sympathetic face. None met her with anything but avoidance. The walk to the rear of the cabin was not long, but each step stretched in the eyes of those watching. Passengers leaned just far enough into the aisle to catch a glimpse. The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed, like the plane itself was holding its breath. Robert stood in the aisle for a moment after Derek and Karen disappeared behind the curtain to the rear galley. His shoulders slumped slightly before he turned to Nadia. Dr. Ellison, I'm sorry you had to experience that on one of our flights. Nadia's eyes shifted to him, calm but deliberate. Make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. Robert nodded, but there was something in his expression that told her he knew it was not the first time and, without real change, would not be the last. Mariah leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. That was something to see. You handled yourself better than most would have. Nadia allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes the loudest response is silence. Mariah tilted her head. You think that's enough? No, Nadia replied, looking out at the endless blue. But it's the first step. The cabin began to stir again. Conversations picked up in low tones. Phones buzzed with notifications, though no one said out loud what they were seeing online. The videos were already moving beyond this plane. In seat 4A, a woman in a gray cardigan tapped her screen repeatedly, her expression a mix of shock and focus. In 2B, the man who had remained quiet for most of the flight finally spoke up. I'm glad someone stepped in. Nadia didn't respond. She didn't need to. The moment had shifted. The balance of power had tilted back to where it belonged, but she knew it was fragile. These moments always were. From behind the curtain came faint voices, Derek's measured tone, Karen's sharper protests. The words were muffled, but the tone carried. Karen was not going quietly. Robert moved down the aisle again, checking on passengers, forcing a semblance of normal service back into the cabin. He offered coffee to those who wanted it, water to those who didn't. But there was a tightness to his smile, a stiffness to his movements. Nadia accepted a glass of water, her fingers curling lightly around the cool surface. She sipped slowly, her mind not on the taste, but on the meaning of what had just happened. Her whole career had been built on creating systems where fairness was the foundation, where respect was non-negotiable. Yet here she was, in the very system she had shaped, watching it falter under the weight of someone's prejudice. She wondered how many others had been through something similar without anyone to intervene, without an air marshal to say enough, without phones to record. Mariah shifted in her seat, her voice lower now. "You know, the second we land, this is going to be everywhere. Are you ready for that?" Nadia met her eyes. "I've been ready for years." The rest of the flight carried a strange quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a normal cruise at altitude, but the muted atmosphere of people processing what they had just seen. The moments stretched between glances, between sips of coffee and the rustle of magazines. When the seatbelt sign lit for descent, Robert's voice came over the intercom, his tone careful, almost formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." Nadia glanced once more at the clouds outside, now giving way to the shimmering coastline in the distance. She knew the landing would be the start, not the end. The real turbulence was waiting on the ground. The coastline slid beneath them, sunlight glinting off the water like scattered shards of glass. The landing gear lowered with a low mechanical groan, a sound Nadia had always associated with arrival and progress. This time, it felt like a signal that the quiet battlefield inside the cabin was about to spill into the world outside. The descent was steady, the cabin tilted slightly forward, and the muted roar of the engines deepened. Passengers glanced out their windows, some pretending to be absorbed in the view, others clearly waiting for what they knew was coming. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that came before a verdict was read. Robert Kane's voice came over the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." His tone was controlled, but there was a faint strain in it, the kind that clings to a person after a confrontation they cannot forget. Behind the rear galley curtain, Derek Shaw stood watch over Karen. Her voice had quieted, but the tension in her body was visible even from where Nadia sat. Every so often, a muffled sentence would slip through, defensive, indignant, almost pleading. Derek's replies were measured, clipped, unshakable. Nadia sat upright in 1A, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Her gaze moved between the window and the aisle, her mind already running through the next steps. She had been in the public eye long enough to know how this would look from the outside. The moment they touched down, the story would no longer be just about one flight attendant and one passenger. It would be about power, perception, and the question of who belonged where. The wheels kissed the runway with a solid thud, and the reverse thrust filled the cabin with its deep roar. The familiar deceleration pressed passengers back into their seats. As they slowed, Nadia caught sight of flashing blue and red lights waiting near the gate. Police cruisers, airport security vehicles, and farther back, a cluster of news vans with their satellite dishes already aimed skyward. A murmur rose among the passengers. Some reached for their phones. Others leaned to get a better look. The hum of speculation spread through the rows like static. When the seatbelt sign went off, Robert stepped into the aisle but did not begin the usual disembarkation. Instead, he spoke clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated until instructed to leave the aircraft." The curtain to the rear opened, and Derek guided Karen forward. The cuffs on her wrists caught the light. Her chin was lifted slightly, but her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. As they moved past each row, passengers looked away or held up their phones. The clicks and soft chimes of cameras capturing the walk were the only sounds besides the steady shuffle of footsteps. When they reached the front of the cabin, Karen hesitated. Outside the open aircraft door, the sun blazed bright against the tarmac, and beyond that, a row of cameras waited. The police officer at the bottom of the stairs held out a hand to guide her down. She did not take it. Derek gave a short nod, and together they stepped into the open. The moment her feet touched the ground, the shouting began, reporters calling her name, demanding answers. Photographers jostled for angles. She tried to speak, but Derek's voice was firm as he directed her toward the waiting cruiser. From her seat, Nadia watched the scene unfold through the oval window. The image was surreal. Someone who had struck her, insulted her, now dwarfed by the scale of her own collapse. Robert turned to Nadia. "You can deplane now. Dr. Ellison, security will escort you through the terminal." She stood, smoothing her blazer, her movements deliberate. When she stepped into the sunlight, the glare forced her eyes to narrow for a moment. A ripple moved through the media line as cameras shifted from Karen to her. "Dr. Ellison, what happened on the flight? Do you plan to press charges? Were you targeted because of your race?" She did not answer. Not here. Not now. The questions would be answered on her terms. Patrick Grayson was waiting at the base of the stairs with two members of her legal team. His expression was grim but steady. "We saw the footage. The board is already in session." Nadia inclined her head. "Then we have work to do." They moved as a group toward the terminal, the cameras following from behind the barrier. As they entered the cool air of the jet bridge, the noise of the tarmac faded, replaced by the more controlled hum of the airport interior. Still, eyes followed them, passengers, staff, travelers pause in mid-step as recognition spread. Inside a small conference room near a private security exit, Nadia sat while Patrick closed the door. Media is already spinning it. "Flight attendant arrested for assault in aviation CEO. You're trending everywhere." Nadia took a slow breath. "Good. Let them see. But this isn't just about me. I want every complaint that was ever filed against her on my desk. And not just her. Every crew member with a pattern of behavior like this." Patrick nodded. "Legal's pulling records. This is going to hit the company hard. Then it needs to hit hard enough that it changes things," Nadia said. Her voice was calm, but the edge in it was unmistakable. Mariah Cortez was waiting just outside. When Patrick opened the door, she stepped in, holding out a slip of paper. "This is my number. I'll be your witness, and I know 2 other passengers willing to do the same." Nadia took the paper, meeting her eyes. "I appreciate your courage." Mariah shook her head. "Courage is staying silent when you know you should speak. I'm just doing what's right." After she left, Patrick glanced at Nadia. "The police are processing her now. They're saying she's being booked for assault and removed from active duty indefinitely." Nadia looked toward the window, where the afternoon light fell in a golden stripe across the carpet. Indefinitely is not enough. Outside in the terminal, the echo of the incident still vibrated. Travelers scrolled through their feeds, seeing the video from multiple angles, the sound of the slap, Karen's words, Derek's command. It was all there, unedited, undeniable. Some viewers would see only the drama. Others would understand the weight of what it meant. Nadia knew the difference, and she was counting on the latter to grow louder than the former. She rose from her chair. "Let's get back to headquarters. I want a full briefing tonight." As they moved toward the private exit, Patrick fell into step beside her. "You know, this is going to be more than just a personnel issue. The FAA's going to look into it. Civil rights groups are already reaching out. Then we make this the moment that forces change," Nadia said without hesitation. At the curb, a black sedan waited. Cameras flashed again from a distance, but this time there was no rush, no shouted questions. The image of her walking calmly to the car, flanked by her team, would make its own statement. As the door closed behind her and the city streets began to roll past, Nadia let her gaze settle on the skyline ahead. The fight was no longer about one confrontation at 38,000 feet. It was about what kind of skies people deserved to fly under. The black sedan carrying Nadia slipped through a private gate and into the city traffic. She sat in the back seat, hands resting lightly on her knees, her mind already building the scaffolding of what would come next. Outside, the streets blurred past newsstands with their papers still showing yesterday's headlines, pedestrians leaning over their phones, some of them no doubt already watching the footage from Flight 217. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it for now. Every message could wait until she had control of the narrative. Control was everything in moments like this. Across town, the footage had begun to loop on every major network. The moment of the slap was replayed from 3 different passenger videos. Each angle captured the sting, the words, the sharp intake of breath from the nearby seats. Then came Derek's voice, cutting through the tension, his calm authority stripping Karen of the control she thought she had. By the time Nadia arrived at Ellison Aerospace headquarters, the front steps were already lined with cameras. Security guided her through a side entrance, but she could feel the heat of the flashbulbs even from behind the glass doors. Inside, Patrick Grayson was waiting with a tablet in hand. "It's everywhere," he said without preamble. CNN, MSNBC, local affiliates, international news, social media is on fire. And it's not just the slap, they're pulling up old stories, old complaints about her behavior. Nadia walked with him down the long marble corridor toward the elevator. "How old? Some go back 8 years," Patrick said. Crew reports filed and buried. Passenger complaints that never made it past middle management. We're talking about a pattern that the airline ignored because she had seniority and a spotless on-paper record. The elevator doors closed, and for a moment the noise of the outside world fell away. Nadia's reflection looked back at her from the polished metal, the faint redness on her cheek barely visible under her makeup. She thought about how many others had walked off planes with marks that faded from their skin but stayed sharp in their memory. The boardroom was waiting when they stepped inside. Screens on the walls played muted news feeds, each with the same headline in bold: "Flight attendant arrested for assaulting CEO." A handful of executives stood as Nadia entered. She took her seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin." Patrick connected his tablet to the main display. "These are the initial metrics over 4. 2 million views across platforms in the last 2 hours. Engagement is high, and most of it is on your side. But there's also pushback from some who say this is being exaggerated for PR." Nadia let the words settle before she spoke. "We're not here to argue with trolls. We're here to set a standard. I want a full review of every crew complaint filed in the last decade, names redacted for privacy, but patterns flagged. We will not keep people in the air who treat passengers like this." One of the board members cleared his throat. "Dr. Ellison, this could expose us to significant legal risk. If we dig into old files, We might uncover things we'd rather not be forced to report. Nadia's eyes locked on his. Then we report them. All of them. If the cost of keeping our reputation is protecting abusers, then our reputation isn't worth keeping. Silence filled the room. Patrick's pen tapped once against his notebook, then stilled. Across the city, Karen sat in a cramped holding room at the airport's police station. The fluorescent lights made the gray in her hair more noticeable. She had been fingerprinted, photographed, and given a paper cup of water she hadn't touched. The reality of her situation was beginning to press in from all sides. She replayed the moment again and again, the slap, the sting in her palm, the looks from the passengers, Derek's voice telling her to step away. She had believed, even then, that she was in the right, that her authority as senior crew gave her the power to decide who belonged where. Now, that belief was collapsing under the weight of every headline she could see, scrolling across the small television mounted in the corner. She heard her own words played back on loop. People like her always find ways to cheat the system. Stripped of context, or maybe finally shown in full context, they sounded worse than she had imagined. Her lawyer arrived, a thin man in a wrinkled suit. He set his briefcase on the table and leaned in close. They're filing assault charges. There's also talk of adding a civil rights violation because of the recorded remarks. Karen's mouth went dry. It was just words. He gave her a look that was almost pity. Words matter, especially when they're caught on camera, said to the CEO of the airline, in front of witnesses, back at headquarters. Nadia reviewed the footage again, not because she needed to, but because she understood the power of owning the narrative. Every pause, every silence, every choice she had made on that plane would now be analyzed. The fact that she had stayed seated, that she had spoken so little, was already being framed as remarkable restraint. Patrick placed a folder in front of her. Here's what we have on her. It's worse than I thought. Multiple incidents where passengers complained of verbal abuse, a handful where physical contact was alleged but never confirmed. In each case, management sided with her. Nadia flipped through the pages. Who signed off on these? Patrick hesitated. Some are from people who aren't with the company anymore, but a few still are. She closed the folder, then they'll answer for it. In the hallway, outside the boardroom, Mariah Cortez was waiting. She had come straight from the airport, still carrying her bag. I've spoken to a few other passengers. They're willing to go public. I think you should consider letting them tell the story, not just the media. Nadia nodded slowly. We'll arrange it. The more voices, the harder it is to dismiss. Mariah glanced toward the news screens visible through the glass wall. They're already calling it the Ellison incident. You know that's going to stick. Nadia's expression was unreadable. Then we make it mean something good. By evening, the sun dipped low over the city, and the sky turned the same deep orange as the logo of Ellison Aerospace. Nadia stood at her office window, looking out over the skyline. She knew this was the moment to decide how far she would take it. A personal victory was not enough. She wanted structural change, somewhere in another part of the city. Karen sat alone in her apartment after being released on bail. The television was on but muted, the images still telling her story without sound. She thought of the crew members she had worked with for years, wondering who among them might speak out now that her shield of authority was gone. She thought of the passengers she had dismissed. The ones who had filed complaints she laughed off. For the first time, She wondered what it had cost them to stay silent. By the next morning, the incident from Flight 217 was no longer just a headline. It was a wildfire. Every network carried the story. Talk shows dissected the footage frame by frame. Online, the videos had crossed 10 million views, and hashtags connected to Nadia's name trended across multiple platforms. In one clip, the slap played in slow motion. The sound was crisp, the shock on the faces around it unmistakable. In another, Derek's calm but ironclad command to Karen played on loop, paired with captions declaring, "This is how you shut down prejudice." News anchors speculated on the future of the airline. Civil rights attorneys debated the legal implications. Commentators drew comparisons to other high-profile incidents in air travel, calling this one unique because the passenger was not just a customer. She was the CEO. Inside Ellison Aerospace headquarters, Nadia sat with Patrick Grayson in a glass-walled conference room, reviewing the growing list of passengers willing to make statements. "We have 6 so far," Patrick said, tapping the folder in front of him. "3 have already spoken to the press. The others want to coordinate with us before they do." "Good," Nadia said. "We'll make sure their voices are amplified. This was never just about me." Mariah Cortez entered the room, setting her coffee on the table. "I've been in touch with a few civil rights organizations. They're interested in using this as a case study for bias in customer service industries. If we push for it, we could turn this into a wider movement." Nadia looked at her. "We will push for it, but it has to be strategic. No shouting matches on cable news, no viral outrage without follow-through. I want policy changes, training reforms, accountability mechanisms that actually work." Patrick leaned back in his chair. "You're thinking bigger than the airline." "I am," Nadia said without hesitation, "because this isn't just an airline problem, it's an industry problem. And if we set the standard here, others will have to follow." Across town, Karen Whitfield sat in her apartment with the blinds drawn. Her phone lay face down on the coffee table, buzzing intermittently with messages she no longer wanted to read. The union had called once, offering a generic statement of support, but had since gone silent. Former colleagues had unfriended her online. A few sent curt texts saying they hoped she was holding up, but none offered to meet. She turned on the television and immediately regretted it. A news panel was discussing her case. One of the guests was a former flight attendant who spoke about a toxic culture among some senior crew, where authority over passengers could morph into entitlement. The guest didn't mention Karen by name, but the implication was obvious. Karen muted the TV and stared at the screen. She told herself they didn't know the full story, that she had been provoked, that she was only enforcing the rules, but the certainty she had felt on that plane was starting to erode. Every replay of the footage made it harder to convince even herself. At the airport, federal authorities had begun their own inquiry. The FAA released a short statement confirming they were reviewing conduct by crew members on Flight 217 and would ensure all federal regulations and passenger rights protocols were upheld. Patrick slid a printout across the table to Nadia. "They're moving fast. That's good for us. It means they're taking it seriously." Nadia skimmed the page. "We'll cooperate fully. Make sure legal has all documentation ready." Later that afternoon, she stepped into the company's media studio. A camera crew was waiting to record her official statement. She wore a dark navy blazer, her posture as composed as it had been in Seat 1A. When the red light above the lens came on, her voice was steady. What happened on Flight 217 was unacceptable, not just for me, but for every passenger who has ever been treated as if they did not belong. This company was built on the belief that the skies are for everyone. We will not tolerate behavior that undermines that belief. Effective immediately. We are launching a full review of our training, our reporting systems, and our accountability processes. We will work with independent civil rights organizations to ensure these changes are meaningful and lasting. The video went live within the hour. Within another hour, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Comments poured in from people who had experienced similar treatment, some in the air, others in restaurants, hotels, or other customer-facing industries. The phrase, "the skies are for everyone," began appearing on protest signs outside airport terminals. Meanwhile, Karen's lawyer urged her to stay quiet. "Anything you say now will be used against you. Let me do the talking." But silence felt like a prison. Karen wanted to explain herself, to tell her side, but every time she thought about doing an interview, she imagined the clip of her words being played alongside the slap. There was no version of her story that could erase that moment. In a small cafe near the courthouse, two of the passengers from 217 met with a local reporter. One described the fear of speaking up in the moment, the way the cabin had frozen. The other admitted they had pulled out their phone, not to help, but because they knew something was happening that people would want to see. Both said they regretted not acting sooner. Back at headquarters, Nadia reviewed the transcript of that interview. She recognized the pattern. People often froze in moments of injustice, afraid of the consequences of stepping in. That was why public accountability mattered. It showed that silence had a cost. Patrick entered her office holding a list. "We've got confirmation that 2 more former employees are willing to go on record about Karen's behavior. One of them says she filed a complaint 3 years ago that disappeared after her supervisor warned her to drop it." Nadia set down her pen. "We'll protect them if they face retaliation. Give them our legal team's number." That night, Nadia returned home to her quiet penthouse. She made tea and sat by the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass. She thought about the woman in seat 3C, speaking up when others stayed silent. She thought about the man in 2B, admitting too late that he should have acted. She knew the next phase would be harder. The adrenaline of the incident was fading, replaced by the slow, grinding work of reform. But she was ready for it. She had been ready for years. Somewhere across town, Karen lay awake in bed, the glow of her muted television casting shadows across the room. She scrolled through her phone, past headlines, past comments, past photos of her in handcuffs. Her finger hovered over the option to delete her social media accounts, but she hesitated. In the quiet, she whispered to herself, as if saying it softly could make it true. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The next morning, Ellison Aerospace's top executives gathered in the largest conference room on the 12th floor. The glass walls offered a sweeping view of the skyline, but no one was looking outside. Every screen in the room was frozen on the same paused frame the moment Derek Shaw placed Karen in handcuffs. The board members sat in tense silence as Nadia Ellison entered. She didn't rush. Her steps were measured, her presence filling the space without her having to say a word. She took her place at the head of the long mahogany table, set her notes down, and looked each person in the eye. "Let's begin," she said simply, Patrick Grayson sat to her right, a tablet in front of him. We've completed a preliminary internal review. The findings are, he hesitated, searching for the right word, disturbing. A slide appeared on the main screen. It listed more than a dozen prior incidents involving Karen Whitfield. Most were marked as resolved without disciplinary action. A few had been flagged by multiple passengers. Nadia's gaze didn't waver. How many of these were brought to management's attention and ignored? Patrick tapped the screen, highlighting the numbers. Over half. In some cases, complaints disappeared entirely. Supervisors either buried them or reclassified them as minor service issues. A murmur went around the table. One executive, a man in a pinstripe suit, leaned forward. Dr. Ellison, with all due respect, dredging up old cases could open us to lawsuits from former employees. It could damage our stock value. Are we prepared for that? Nadia's voice was calm, but carried the weight of finality. We are not in the business of protecting wrongdoers for the sake of our share price. If we are, then we don't deserve to be in business at all. The man leaned back, clearly unsettled. Another executive, a woman in her 50s, spoke cautiously. I agree in principle, but these changes, they will require overhauling our entire HR and training systems. That is a massive undertaking. Nadia didn't flinch. Then we undertake it, and we do it now. This incident has made it clear that our systems for accountability are broken. If they can fail a passenger, they can fail anyone. Patrick switched to the next slide, a proposed framework for reform. It included mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, a new independent reporting line, and a zero-tolerance policy for confirmed incidents of discrimination or harassment. One board member shifted uncomfortably. Zero tolerance leaves no room for nuance. What if an employee makes a single mistake? Then they will be retrained, Nadia said, her tone firm. But if they cross the line intentionally, if they harm passengers or colleagues, they will not fly under this company's name again. Silence settled again. Outside the glass walls, the city moved on, unaware of the weight of the conversation happening above it. Mariah Cortez had been invited to speak as a witness. When she entered the room, all eyes turned to her. She wore a charcoal blazer, her hair neatly pulled back, her expression calm but direct. On that flight, she began. I watched a senior crew member target a passenger without cause. I watched the cabin freeze, and I saw the fear in people's faces. It wasn't just fear of the conflict, it was fear of getting involved. That culture starts at the top. Her words cut through the air. She turned slightly toward Nadia. The way you handled yourself mattered. People will remember it. But if nothing changes after this, then that moment will be just another viral video. Nadia nodded slowly. That's why we're here. This isn't about a headline. This is about building a culture where no one hesitates to do the right thing because they're afraid of retaliation. The woman in her 50s spoke again. I can support this if we can manage the public relations side carefully. We cannot appear reactive. We have to own the change, not just respond to criticism. Nadia allowed herself the faintest smile. Owning the change is the point. Patrick clicked to the final slide, a timeline for implementation. Some items could be rolled out within weeks. Others would take months, but the work would begin immediately. As the meeting wound down, Nadia remained seated while others gathered their materials. When the room had mostly cleared, she looked at Patrick. Schedule follow-ups with department heads. I want weekly progress reports." He nodded. "You know there will be pushback. Some people will feel threatened." "Good," Nadia said. "That means we're aiming in the right direction." After Patrick left, Nadia sat alone for a moment, the hum of the city faint through the glass. She thought about Karen not with sympathy, but with clarity. People didn't wake up one day and decide to act the way she had. It was learned, reinforced, protected, and now it had to be unlearned elsewhere. Karen sat across from her lawyer in a dimly lit office. The blinds were closed against the morning sun. Her lawyer laid out the charges in a flat-voice misdemeanor assault, possible civil rights violation, termination from the airline. Karen stared at the papers in front of her. Termination. They can, the lawyer said, and they will. The evidence is clear. The recordings are public. There's no plausible defense that will save your job. Karen's chest tightened. Then, what happens to me? That, her lawyer replied, depends on how you handle what comes next. She left the office, feeling smaller than she ever had. Outside, the city bustled on, indifferent to her fall. Back at headquarters, Nadia reviewed a press release drafted by the communications team. It outlined the company's new initiatives, committed to full cooperation with the FAA, and emphasized a zero-tolerance stance. She read it twice, made a few adjustments, and approved it. As she stepped out of her office, Mariah was waiting by the elevator. "How did they take it? They'll fall in line," Nadia said. "They don't have a choice." Mariah smiled faintly. "That's leadership." The elevator doors opened, and Nadia stepped inside, feeling the weight of the moment. The real work had only just begun, but she could already feel the shift. The culture that had allowed silence and complicity to thrive was cracking. And once a crack starts, the whole structure can change. Karen Whitfield woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. It had been buzzing off and on since dawn, each vibration rattling the glass of water she had left untouched from the night before. She didn't reach for it. She already knew what would be waiting: more missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, more unread messages she didn't want to read. The television was still on from the night before, the light from the screen casting a pale glow across her small apartment. The news anchor's voice was low and steady, narrating over the now infamous footage of Flight 217. Karen didn't need to look to know which clip it was. She could see it in her mind without trying the sharp motion of her own arm, the sound of her palm meeting skin, the sudden stillness of the cabin afterward. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't stop the cold that had settled somewhere deep inside her. The knock on the door was soft at first, then louder. She considered ignoring it, but the persistence wore her down. She shuffled to the door and opened it to find her neighbor, Mrs. Lewis, holding a grocery bag. "You haven't been out in days," Mrs. Lewis said gently. "I thought you could use a few things." Karen took the bag, mumbled a thank you, and set it on the counter. Inside were basics: bread, milk, a small pack of tea bags. The kindness only made her throat tighter. She'd spent most of her career commanding cabins, directing passengers with brisk authority, and now she couldn't even bring herself to go to the store. Her lawyer had called the night before, repeating the advice he'd given from the start: stay quiet, stay out of sight, let him handle the public. But silence was proving heavier than she had imagined. The world outside her apartment was moving on without her, Yet every news cycle seemed to find a new way to replay her worst moment. She sat at the small kitchen table, staring at her phone. Her contacts list felt like a graveyard. Friends from work had stopped calling. A few had sent short messages in the beginning variations of "hang in there" or "hope you're okay," but those had dried up quickly. She had scrolled through her social media accounts until the comments became too much to bear. Some were vicious, others mocking, and a few cut deeper because they came from people she had once considered allies. By late morning, the sun streamed through the blinds, slicing the room into strips of light and shadow. Karen poured herself a cup of tea but didn't drink it. She found herself opening the Notes app on her phone, typing without thinking. It started as a list of things she wanted to say to Nadia. Some were defensive, others bitter. But as the minutes passed, her words shifted. She began to remember the look on Nadia's face after the slap, not just shock, but something quieter, heavier, like recognition of an old wound reopened. The memory made her hands still over the keyboard. She deleted the defensive lines and began again. This time, her words were less about justifying herself and more about acknowledging what she had done. By the time she stopped, she had written a full letter of apology. She read it twice, then set the phone face down. The thought of sending it made her chest tighten. The world would see it as a desperate move, not a sincere one, and maybe it was. Across the city, Nadia was in motion. She had spent the morning in back-to-back meetings, each focused on the reforms she had announced. The calls with legal advisors and human resources leads were precise and goal-driven. Every barrier raised was met with the same answer: find a way around it. Patrick stepped into her office mid-afternoon with an update. FAA is officially opening a civil rights review of the incident. They're asking for all internal records. Give them everything, Nadia said without looking up from the report she was reading. Patrick lingered for a moment. I heard from someone in the union leadership. They're preparing a statement condemning Karen's actions. It won't name her directly, but it's clear who they mean. Nadia set down the report. That's their way of protecting themselves. They want to show they don't condone it, but they also don't want to take responsibility for enabling it. You're not wrong, Patrick said, but it still helps our case. Nadia leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the skyline. Helping the case is one thing, changing the culture is another. We have to keep the pressure on. In her apartment, Karen sat at the table as the afternoon light shifted. She scrolled through news articles, each one seeming more final than the last. The airline had announced her removal from active duty. The police had confirmed the charges. Her name was becoming a cautionary tale in training manuals, according to one report. She turned the television back up just in time to hear a former colleague speaking to a reporter. He didn't say her name, but the description was unmistakable. Some people in senior positions start to think the rules don't apply to them. That's when things go wrong. Karen muted the TV again. She stood at the sink, running cold water over her hands, trying to shake the restless energy building inside her. The letter she had written still sat in her phone. She imagined what it would be like to deliver it in person, to face Nadia and say the words out loud. But the idea felt impossible. By evening, the city outside was bathed in the amber light of sunset. Nadia left headquarters, her driver pulling into the quiet streets near her home. She was tired, but it was the kind of fatigue that came from movement, from knowing each day was part of something larger. Karen, on the other hand, sat in the stillness of her apartment as the light faded. The quiet was louder at night. She wondered how long it would take before she could step outside without feeling the weight of every glance. She picked up her phone and opened the letter again. This time, she read it slowly, line by line. The words felt raw, unfinished, but they were the truest thing she had written in months. She saved the draft and set the phone down. For now, it would stay unsent. 2 weeks after Flight 217, the storm had not passed. It had grown. The footage still appeared in news cycles. But now it was accompanied by something larger industry leaders discussing what they were calling the Ellison Protocol. It started quietly. A small regional airline announced it was reviewing its crew training manuals, citing recent events that highlighted the need for cultural sensitivity and passenger rights protections. Within days, 2 major carriers followed, each unveiling their own initiatives to retrain staff and improve reporting systems. Though none mentioned Nadia by name, the connection was obvious. Inside Ellison Aerospace headquarters, Patrick Grayson brought Nadia a stack of reports. This is the current tally. 12 airlines have announced changes in the last week. 5 of them are international, and the FAA wants to meet with you personally. Nadia flipped through the pages without slowing. Set the meeting. The sooner we standardize these protections, the better. Patrick hesitated. You're aware they might ask you to share our internal procedures once we finalize them. Are you prepared to give that away? Yes, Nadia said without looking up. Because this isn't about competitive advantage. It's about safety and dignity. If they adopt what we create, that's a win. That afternoon, she appeared on a nationally televised interview. The studio lights were warm on her face, the cameras close enough to catch every flicker of expression. The host introduced her as the CEO who turned a mid-flight assault into a movement. Dr. Ellison, the host began. You've become the face of a conversation that extends far beyond your airline. How do you feel about this level of attention? Nadia folded her hands. Attention is only useful if it leads to action. The danger with moments like this is that they burn hot for a few weeks and then fade. My focus is on making sure this doesn't fade. The host leaned in. And how do you do that? By embedding the change into policy, training, and culture, Nadia said. That way, even if the cameras move on, the systems remain. Viewers at home saw a composed leader, but inside, Nadia carried the weight of each decision. She knew that lasting change required persistence long after the headlines cooled. Meanwhile, in Karen Whitfield's small apartment, the television was on the same channel. She sat curled in an armchair, watching the interview unfold. The sight of Nadia, calm and confident under the glare of national media, stirred a complicated mix of resentment and reluctant respect. Karen muted the sound but couldn't look away. She recognized the steadiness in Nadia's posture. She had seen that kind of presence before, and pilots commanding a cockpit or senior managers holding a briefing. It was the kind of authority that couldn't be faked. The knock at her door startled her. It was her lawyer, holding a folder. I have news. The airline is offering a settlement if you agree not to contest your termination and refrain from making public statements about the incident. Karen took the folder, scanning the legal language. And if I refuse, then they fight you in court, and you lose. The evidence is overwhelming. She set the folder down without answering. The silence in the apartment was thick. She wondered if the letters she had written to Nadia would change anything not in court. but in her own mind. Back at Ellison Aerospace, Mariah Cortez arrived for a meeting with Nadia and Patrick. She had been working with several advocacy groups since the incident, helping to draft what they were calling a passenger rights charter. "This is more than just an internal policy," Mariah explained, sliding a document across the table. "It's a public commitment. If your airline adopts it first, others will have to follow or explain why they won't." Nadia read the first lines. "Every passenger has the right to travel free from discrimination, harassment, or retaliation." The language was clear, unambiguous. "I'll sign it," Nadia said, "and we'll make it part of the Ellison Protocol." Patrick smiled faintly. "It has a nice ring to it." News of the charter spread quickly once it was announced. Commentators called it bold, critics called it unnecessary, but passengers called it overdue. At airports across the country, travelers began asking airlines if they were signatories. The FAA meeting came 3 days later in a conference room at their Washington headquarters. Nadia sat at one end of the long table, facing a panel of officials. They asked about the Flight 217 incident, the company's response, and her plans for industry reform. "We're not here to punish a single airline," one official said. "We want to raise the standard for everyone. What you've done in 2 weeks is more than some carriers manage in years." Nadia leaned forward slightly. "Then, let's not waste time. I'll give you our full policy framework. Use it. Improve it. Just make sure it's enforced." By the time she left the meeting, she knew the protocol was no longer just a company initiative. It was becoming a federal benchmark. In the weeks that followed, training sessions at Ellison Aerospace began rolling out. Crews were introduced to new guidelines, anonymous reporting tools, and scenarios designed to challenge unconscious bias. Resistance was minimal, in part because everyone understood the scrutiny the company was under. Passengers noticed changes too. Cabin greetings felt warmer. Conflicts were addressed quickly and quietly. Complaints were acknowledged instead of dismissed. The culture was shifting. And for those who had been silent witnesses on Flight 217, the difference was undeniable. One evening, as Nadia left the office, Patrick walked with her to the elevator. "You realize we're months away from full implementation, but the public already thinks the job is done." Nadia pressed the elevator button. "The public sees the headlines. We see the work. That's how it should be." In her apartment, Karen finally opened the letter she had written weeks ago. She read it again, the words feeling both too much and not enough. She thought about sending it, but the fear of how it might be received stopped her. The settlement papers still sat on the table, unsigned. She looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, the woman she had tried to humiliate was changing an entire industry. Karen closed her eyes, the weight of it pressing down on her. For the first time, she wondered if the only way forward was to acknowledge, fully and without excuses, what she had done. It was still early when Nadia arrived at the private terminal. The glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, letting in a cool draft from the air-conditioned lobby. For the first time since Flight 217, she was boarding one of her company's aircraft, not as an executive on business, but as a passenger. She moved through security with quiet efficiency. There were no cameras this time, no reporters waiting to ask questions. Still, she felt the eyes of the staff follow her, not with suspicion, but with a kind of cautious respect. The boarding process was smooth. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, The warm air from outside mixed with the faint scent of jet fuel. The hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit filled the space. At the cabin door, a flight attendant greeted her with a genuine smile. "Good morning, Dr. Ellison. Welcome aboard." The words were simple, but they carried a different weight now. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt in the eyes of the crew member. Nadia returned the smile. "Thank you. Good morning." She made her way to seat 2A, settling in as the other passengers boarded. The cabin was bright with morning light streaming through the windows. The leather seats gleamed, and the air felt fresher than she remembered. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a familiar face a few rows back. Mariah Cortez was placing a bag in the overhead compartment. Their eyes met, and a brief smile passed between them. No words were needed. Once everyone was seated, the crew began their pre-flight checks. Nadia watched closely, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. She wanted to see the reforms in motion, to feel the difference she had fought for. The head flight attendant, a tall man with a calm voice, made his way through the aisle. His interactions were measured but warm, his tone consistent whether speaking to passengers in suits or those in worn travel clothes. There was no sense of hierarchy beyond the safety procedures. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Nadia leaned back in her seat. The safety demonstration played, and she noticed subtle changes language that emphasized respect, inclusivity, and the right of every passenger to a safe and dignified journey. The engines roared to life, and soon they were climbing above the city. The clouds broke apart in the sunlight, scattering shadows over the ground far below. For the first time since that day, Nadia felt the familiar peace she used to find in the sky. An hour into the flight, a small moment caught her attention. A passenger in row 5 had pressed the call button. The flight attendant knelt beside her seat, speaking in a low voice, then returned moments later with a blanket and a cup of tea. The exchange was quick, but there was a level of care that had been absent before. Mariah stopped by Nadia's seat as she returned from the restroom. "I can see the difference," she said quietly. "It feels lighter." Nadia nodded. "That's the goal. Not perfection, just better." They spoke for a few minutes about the latest developments. Mariah told her about new passenger rights seminars she was helping to organize. Nadia shared updates on the Ellison Protocol's adoption by other carriers. The conversation felt easy, the kind that could only happen between people who had been through something together. Midway through the flight, the head flight attendant approached Nadia. "Dr. Ellison, I wanted to thank you personally. I've been with the company for 15 years, and this is the first time I've seen real change happen this fast." She met his eyes, then helped make sure it lasts. He nodded. "That's the plan." The rest of the flight passed quietly. Passengers read, napped, or watched the in-flight entertainment. There were no raised voices, no tension humming beneath the surface, just the soft rhythm of travel. As they began their descent, Nadia glanced out the window at the landscape below. The coastline curved gently, the sunlight shimmering off the water. She felt a calm resolve settle over her. Change was never finished. It was something you had to keep choosing, over and over. When the wheels touched down, there was the usual rustle of passengers preparing to leave. Nadia remained seated, letting the crowd move ahead. Mariah paused at the door before stepping out. "It was good to see you up here again." "Likewise," Nadia said. She waited until the aisle was clear, then stepped into the sunlight outside the aircraft. The air was warm, carrying the faint tang of salt from the nearby ocean. She walked across the tarmac with the steady confidence of someone who knew her place was not just in the boardroom, but here among the people her company served. In that moment, she realized the journey back to the skies wasn't just hers. It belonged to every passenger who would board a flight and know they deserved to be there, without question. The day was warm, with a thin veil of clouds softening the sunlight over the city. From her office, on the top floor of Ellison Aerospace headquarters, Nadia Ellison could see the sweep of the skyline, the airport in the distance, and the faint silhouettes of aircraft rising into the sky. It had been 3 months since Flight 217, 3 months since the slap, the silence, the command that had turned the balance of power in an instant. 3 months since she had walked off that plane into a storm of cameras and questions. The headlines had cooled, replaced by new scandals, new stories. But the work had not stopped. The Ellison Protocol was now adopted by more than half of the country's major airlines. The FAA had issued its own strengthened guidelines, citing her company's reforms as a model. Training sessions were ongoing, feedback loops established, accountability systems restructured. There were still moments of resistance. A handful of employees grumbled about the changes, some quietly, others not so quietly. But the old culture, the one that allowed bias to hide in plain sight, was cracking, piece by piece. Nadia turned from the window as Patrick Grayson entered with a folder. "We've got the latest adoption numbers. 2 more international carriers signed on this morning." She flipped through the pages, scanning the signatures. "Good. Keep tracking the follow-through, not just the announcements." Patrick nodded. "There's something else. We received a letter for you." He handed her a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was careful, almost hesitant. Nadia opened it and read in silence. The words were an apology stiff in places, halting in others but unmistakably genuine. The signature at the bottom was one she knew well. Karen Whitfield. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't try to explain away what had happened. It simply acknowledged the harm, both in action and in words, and expressed regret for the pain caused not only to Nadia, but to everyone who had been watching that day. Nadia set the letter down on her desk. She didn't feel triumph reading it. She didn't feel pity either. What she felt was a kind of release, a quiet closing of a door that had been left ajar since the moment Karen's hand met her cheek. Patrick was watching her. "Do you want me to respond?" "No," she said softly. "Some things don't need an answer." The act of writing it was the answer. That afternoon, Nadia visited the airport for an unannounced walkthrough. She moved through the concourses like any other traveler, watching interactions between crew and passengers. She saw a flight attendant kneel to speak to an elderly man in a wheelchair. A gate agent patiently explain a delay to a family with small children. A security officer greeting a passenger by name. It wasn't perfect, she didn't expect it to be, but it was different. The tone had shifted. The air felt lighter. Near one gate, she spotted Mariah Cortez sitting with a coffee, reading on her tablet. Mariah noticed her and stood, smiling warmly. "Still making the rounds." "I see. Old habits," Nadia replied. They walked together for a while, talking about the changes they had seen. Mariah mentioned a recent case where a passenger spoke up for someone else during boarding. "It was small, but it mattered," she said. "People are noticing the difference. They're less afraid to get involved now. That's the real victory." Nadia said. As they approached the security checkpoint, Mariah paused. You know, the moment you stayed in that seat, it did more than just protect your dignity. It gave the rest of us a reason to believe we could do the same. Nadia held her gaze for a moment. It wasn't just my fight. It never is. Later that evening, back in her office, Nadia sat with a cup of tea as the city lights began to glow. She thought about the long arc from that day in the sky to this moment. Change, she realized, was not a sudden thing. It was 1,000 small shifts, a series of choices made by people deciding not to look away. She picked up the letter from Karen once more before slipping it into a drawer. It would stay there not as a reminder of the insult, but of the possibility of reckoning. On her way out, she stopped at the large photograph hanging in the hallway. It showed the first aircraft Ellison Aerospace had ever built. Its nose pointed toward an open sky. Beneath it was the company's motto, etched in silver letters. The skies are for everyone. The words had always been part of the brand. Now, they were part of the culture. When Nadia stepped outside, the night air was cool against her skin. A plane passed overhead, its lights blinking as it climbed higher into the darkness. She watched it until it was just a glimmer, then turned toward her car. She knew there would be more battles ahead, more moments where silence would tempt people to look the other way. But she also knew that somewhere, on some future flight, a passenger would sit a little taller, speak a little louder, because they had seen what was possible when someone refused to be moved. And that, she thought, was worth every step it had taken to get here. Some stories fade when the headlines do. This one didn't. From the silence after the slap to the roar of reform that followed, Dr. Nadia Ellison's journey wasn't just about personal dignity. It was about shifting an entire culture, one decision, one policy, one conversation at a time. She never raised her voice. She never sought revenge. She simply refused to be erased. And in doing so, she gave others permission to take up space, to speak, to stand when standing is hard. The flight attendant who struck her lost her career that day, but more importantly, the silence that allowed such things to happen began to crack. In its place grew something stronger: accountability, empathy, and the knowledge that respect in the skies is not a privilege. It's a right, but the work isn't finished. Bias hides in corners we don't always see, and the question remains the next time injustice walks down the aisle. Will you look away, or will you stand if this story moved you? Help it move others. Like, share, and subscribe to Real Life Stories New, because every voice that joins us makes it harder for silence to win. And trust me, you'll want to be here for the next story.